So because we have the new fifth edition of Problems in Modern Latin American History, this time edited by James Wood and Anna Alexander, I need to update some things in the course. That means, at least what I'm thinking it means, is focusing more on key questions for each of the units that we'll be working on together, and then using the materials in this book, which include both primary and secondary sources, to help us come to some answers to those questions. So these intro videos then, I'm hoping will be vehicles by which I can introduce the main themes of the unit that we'll be working on together in terms of the main question. And then also, also interject a couple multiple choice questions that you will respond to here. So, for this first unit, our central question is, how did colonial era institutions and issues shape the process of Latin American independence? So this question tries to touch on the major time frames that we'll be looking at, as well as the major themes. The major kind of theme and process during the first few decades of the 19th century in Latin America was the process of gaining independence from Spain and Portugal. Although John Green, in the video that I have added as a reference, refers to these conflicts and wars as Latin American revolutions, they weren't. Or at least not really, because the events that were labeled revolutions in Latin America came later. They came in the 20th century, as we'll see. And to make that distinction, these events in the early 19th century are referred to as independence movements, even though they were very violent and involved a lot of destruction, devastation, but also something that scholars have come to know as nation building. So we're going to try to touch on all of those various things by looking primarily at the documents in the problems reader, but also by looking at the information included in John Chastain's textbook, Born in Blood and Fire. Born in Blood and Fire gives you that overview, that historical context that you'll need to better understand the information in the other reader. Of course, the editors have provided excellent introductions for each of the chapters that you'll be looking at to provide some of that context, but they don't get quite as broad as Chastain does. So those two books work together in that way. Chastain provides the broader context, and Wood and Alexander help us to think about the precise details that will allow us to answer our questions. So, thinking of the question that I just read to you from my notebook, and that we have for this first unit that we're working this way, we need to also think about what things do we need to break down in order to, and understand in order to answer that larger question. So there are a few different time periods that are mentioned and certain institutions and issues. So right now, I'm going to stop and ask you a couple of questions. All right, so based on what you've just worked through in those multiple choice questions, we've come to identify that we're talking about the long colonial period in Latin America's history, so everything that came before the starting point for this class chronologically. And we're also thinking about institutions like the church. We're thinking about the state, which during the colonial period, of course, was the mother countries such as Spain and Portugal, but the ways that they administered their colonies in Latin America were based around institutions called viceroyalties and audiencias. So we have all of those things going on in terms of labor, and this is something we'll see in a couple of the readings in the colonialism chapter, or the colonial period chapter, I should say. We have things like encomienda, we have repartimiento, we have La República de los Indios, or the Republic of the Indians, versus the Republic of the Españoles, or the Spaniards. All of these different ways that Spanish colonial officials tried to divide up their societies to ensure the authority of the colonial power. All of that broke down for a few different reasons during the early 19th century. So we'll be reading about how and why colonial rule broke down. Excuse me. It had to do both with the reality that the Spanish and Portuguese empires were in a state of decline for a few reasons, but also with the reality that Napoleon Bonaparte in France was conquering everything he possibly could in Europe, which in 1808 included Spain. He tried to get Portugal as well, which he sort of did, but the Portuguese royal family fled to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in order to escape imprisonment under Napoleon. They had the aid of the British. So the British were kind of Napoleon's main nemesis in Europe. All of that to say, there are these larger events going on that opened up space for institutions such as cabildos in Latin American locales to take some authority, and although they said they were holding authority in the name of the king until he could be rightfully put back on his place on the throne after Napoleon Bonaparte's brother was deposed, instead these cabildos became hotbeds of independence-era thinking. And so we also need to think about the reasons that certain places had kind of more liberal independence movements versus more conservative independence movements. And we see conservative independence movements in Mexico and Peru, whereas more liberal independence movements took place in Gran Colombia, what Simón Bolívar envisioned as one unified nation state for most of South America. Of course, that broke into various nation states pretty quickly, and places like Argentina and Chile. Out of all of this, we'll make a connection in the next unit to something called caudillo rule. And so the processes of independence, the status of the newly independent nations, set up pretty unsure footing for these new nations and created a situation in which these more or less military strongmen called caudillos could come to power. So that's the broad kind of narrative that we're working on. There are a couple of questions there for you to have answered. I'm looking forward to seeing your responses and looking forward to seeing how we're able to answer this question together.